Hello, I'm Zach Fine and I'm presenting this video for the International Conference on Men's Issues 2020, and it's called Working with the Trauma of Losing Child Access, and it's going to be about my work as a psychotherapist supporting separated fathers, many of whom are suffering chronic stress and trauma because they can't see their children, either not at all or not as much as they would want to, and not as much as their child or children wants either. If I just maybe I'll just lay out what I'm going to cover and then I'll get into it. So I'm going to start off with a bit about why I'm involved in this work. So that's going to be about my story. Then I'm going to go through some of the main concepts of this work. So trauma, polyvagal theory, which is to do with the nervous system, looking at the family and the broken family as an organism in a sort of systemic way of thinking about it. Then I'm going to look a little bit at the court process, the family court in the UK at least, which I have experience of, and then I'm going to get on to more of a hopefully hopeful piece around psycho-spiritual healing and where fathers can hope to move towards. And then I'm going to finish on attachment, which is a really core concept in psychotherapy and counselling, and but maybe not so much in the domestic abuse and domestic violence industry. And I say industry, I mean all the organisations and programs that are there to protect parents, mainly women, from domestic abuse. And I think that's just a really interesting place to leave it. Because I think there's a lot of hope in the idea of getting these really accepted, uncontroversial concepts a little bit better understood in the mainstream culture in general, I guess, because of fatherlessness is such a common experience now, and so I hope this is all going to be quite child-centric, and I don't really want to get pulled into sort of the polarizing discourse around feminism and post-feminism, and I not that I'm saying that's irrelevant, it's not going to be this is more about how ways of getting back to a balance and a kind of sane way of parenting and co-parenting even after a separation. So, why am I in this work? Well, I became a father on my 25th birthday, actually, and it completely changed my life in loads of wonderful ways, and I wouldn't change anything but now looking back, that was 11 years ago. I can see how it affected me in good and bad ways, and I was not with the mother of my child when my child was born, so I was very happy to support and try and be in my child's life as much as possible. In fact, I was really anxious to do that because I grew up in a single parent family with my mother, and although I had a good relationship with my father, I didn't see him a lot. He lived very far away, and so it became a question of sort of like school holidays, and that was okay, but I think when I got into the work of training as a therapist, I started to realise what the implications had been for me developmentally to not have a masculine role model sort of day to day, and I was very anxious to mitigate that for my child. So I did everything I possibly could to be in her life. I moved countries because I was living abroad. I came to move to a city in the UK and lived around the corner, and I kind of cleared space in my heart, I guess, in my emotional life, so I could focus on that connection with my child. And it went quite well until a couple of years down the line, my daughter's mother let me know that she was going to be moving really far away, and that was devastating for me. I kind of adapted to that, and I kind of created this schedule for myself, which now when I look back was really unhealthy. So I'd work like 11 night shifts. I worked in journalism at the time. I'd work 11 night shifts, then have 4 days off, where I'd travel to go and get my daughter, bring her back, and then be with her, and then travel, take her back, come back straight into another night shift, and do that for another 11 nights, and on and on and on. And that proved unsustainable ultimately. So, and my daughter got older, so then I moved again to be closer to her, and I took a job I didn't really enjoy. And to cut a long story short, I hit the wall. I had an emotional breakdown, and I eventually came back to where I grew up, down in Cornwall in the UK, which is it's a peninsula that's surrounded by an amazing coastline. And I got back into surfing, which is something I'd done as I was growing up, and I really started to understand a little bit more about self-care, because I've been on this kind of almost masochistic mission to do whatever I could to support the connection with my daughter, and it felt like I didn't have a lot of say or control or power in how that was set up. It was really just a case of like, well, if you want to see her, you know where she is. And that was around the time that I got into training as a therapist. I became interested in self-care and all the reasons why I had become depressed and stopped being able to function. Then I had my second child when I was 34, and the relationship, I can see now there was dysfunctional elements in the relationship, as there are in all relationships, but I think one of the kind of structural reasons for that was to do with me and how I had been quite dislocated for that whole period of time. I mean, that was, I'd been doing all that travelling for 10 years, and I guess in some ways I had kind of suborned my career and my personal roadmap to where I didn't really have a clear idea of where I was going as a person. It was more to do with what I could do to facilitate the connection with my child. So that had also happened in a way with my relationships, and this long-term relationship had never really stabilized and grown roots and become a real container. So then when I had my second child, the relationship couldn't really hold all the stress and the natural. It's very challenging the first year of after the birth for every couple, and for us it didn't really work. And again, was history repeating itself. I was really clear that I did not want to produce a situation where any of my children would have to grow up without me in their lives in a really substantial, meaningful way. But it was happening again. My partner, after we separated, she moved a long way away again, and I was just starting the grieving process when this whole new thing started happening, which was totally unexpected. I really didn't anticipate, which was basically not being able to see my child, and not being told that there was. I won't go into the details because it actually did go to family court, and I did okay in family court, and I don't need to go into the details of what happened, but it's enough for me to say that it was the most intimidating, terrifying, scary situation I'd ever been in. And I didn't know what to do. So so maybe that's enough on that. Okay, so I work with separated fathers in this situation, and I run a group. I don't need to go into the details of that, but I'm going to talk you through some of the concepts, some of the psychotherapeutic concepts I work with. And the first one is trauma. And the experience of not being able to see your child is a really primal emergency. I mean, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? It should be obvious that if you stop someone seeing their child, they're going to have a massive, just like huge, deep response on all sorts of levels. So and I think it's really helpful to recognize that this is actually a traumatic experience, because men do actually have feelings, even if they don't process and express them in the same way as women or other people. So I'm going to start with a couple of definitions of trauma, which I think can kind of frame it properly. So this is from Tara Brach in 2011. Trauma is a response to any event encountered as an out of control, frightening experience that disconnects us from all sense of resourcefulness, safety, coping, and or love. And this next one is from Margot Sunderland in 2016. Trauma is not an event itself, but an emotional response to an overwhelmingly painful and stressful event where there was no one there to help you with what was happening at the time. So the central themes in the trauma experience are helplessness, isolation, and loss of power and control. And that differential in power is felt really acutely, and I hope that sort of came across a little bit when I shared my story, and I see it in my clients. There's a lot of implications of trauma in the way that we behave, and I guess if we take a kind of neuroscience perspective, if that's the brain, so that's the brain stem, and that's the back of the brain, and that's the front of the brain. When we feel unsafe, when we're experiencing trauma, so we're not feeling like in the definition, we actually lose the capacity to use our neocortex, which is where we can think rationally from, and we can empathize, and we can plan and become strategic, and we can use this part of our brain to down regulate our panic, our fear, our kind of fight-flight system. And the fight-flight system is sort of, there's essentially a kind of alarm system in the back of the old part of the brain called the limbic system. And in the limbic system is something called the amygdala, and that's kind of like the smoke detector. So if you perceive signs of something that's unsafe, i.e. you're not being able to see your child, and you get a message from your ex saying, yeah, I know we said you could see him, but now we're busy, or whatever, that the alarm goes off. And what that means is that you actually lose the capacity to use the front of the more advanced parts of the brain. So from that point on, you go limbic, which means that you're operating in a kind of survival mode, and it's the fight, flight, freeze response. So your heart rate will go up, your breath, you might breathe shallower, faster. But more importantly, you actually lose the ability to think, because the blood literally drains out of the neocortex. So you can't actually think at that point. You can't be in relation, you can't in connection, because you lose the capacity to empathize. So you go into this survival response, and really the premise of all my work is that we can't do anything until we get out of that. And if both parents are in that, then at least if one gets out of that, at least that can then start to shift the dynamic. But if you both stay in it, and I think we all know people that have stayed in it for years, it's pretty common, because what could be more triggering than disagreeing over your child? So that's the very kind of straightforward starting point for me with this work, is how do we get out of the survival state? And once we can do that, then we can actually start to do something else. So we must recover from the trauma before anything else is possible. Okay, and a really important piece of that is something called polyvagal theory, which is it's really transforming psychotherapy and counselling. Although all vets would know what the vagus nerve is, but still not that many sort of GPs and therapists are aware of how kind of crucial this is to our well-being. So what this is about, it's about your nervous system, and how we can recognize and manage our nervous system state. So our autonomic nervous system is basically everything that's happening automatically without us realizing. So our heartbeat and our organs, and when we're asleep, our digestion, and also our breathing when we're asleep, because we don't need to think about that. And the interesting thing about breath is that we can actually choose to think about it, and then we can use it to up and down regulate our autonomic nervous system. And the key concept in polyvagal theory is that our nervous systems are on a ladder, and there's 3 states that we're all moving up and down in, and it's like a traffic light system. So the green state, which is, I guess, the most desirable one, the most sort of enjoyable place, is all about feeling connected to other human beings, connected to nature, animals, being able to play, being able to open and be expressive, creative, and flourish, and a sort of sense of expansion and connection with everything. and we touched that when we're with. Well, there's different ways for everyone of getting in touch with that, but it could be meeting a really close friend, or just being with your dog, or being on your favourite beach, or for me it's often being in the ocean. Okay, so and then amber, the middle state. So the green state is connected to the vagus nerve. So at the base of the skull, there's the ventral vagus nerve. That's correct. So apologies if I get the terminology slightly wrong. It's not that important. It's just the concept that's really important. So yeah, the middle state is the amber state, and that's connected to your sympathetic nervous system, which is basically a kind of it's more aroused than the green state, and a lot of us are in this state a lot of the time now because of all the we're on screens all the time, and we're working and we're very busy and we don't get a lot of downtime, so a lot of us are in this state probably a bit too much, and there's nothing wrong with it in kind of moderation. I mean, stress is a really really helpful, healthy thing. It helps us to focus and get really stuff done that we need to get done. But we can get trapped in sort of hypervigilance and over arousal for long periods of time, and that's when chronic stress comes in, and that's this is the nervous system state that's associated with that. So it's a sympathetic nervous system, and if you're stuck in that, you can't really rest and digest, so maybe your appetite will be off, maybe your heart rate will be up, maybe your breathing will be up and shallow, like high rapid breathing, and it's this sort of quite kind of wired feeling. And then the red state underneath that is called the dorsal. It's being dorsal, so it's the dorsal vagus nerve. And so when that system comes online, the felt experience is kind of likened to being dead. There's nothingness, the sense of disappearing, being small, not wanting to be seen, not wanting to face the world. You take to your bed, not wanting to get out of bed, or just it's a shut down kind of freeze response. And we all gravitate to a different kind of home base on the ladder, and we also all go up and down the ladder kind of every day, and all of that's kind of normal and healthy. Sometimes for different people the transitions can be quite difficult and confusing, but really the amazing thing is that just by learning about this and getting fluent in recognizing where our nervous systems are, we can start to get loads more control and give ourselves support. If you can recognize that you're in a dorsal state, that's really helpful, because then you can learn what you need to do to come out of it, to come up, and you might be able to come up to sympathetic, then to ventral vagus, green, if you've worked out what things work for you. And that's the kind of work I'm doing with fathers, because a lot of these guys, like I was, are just not functioning. I couldn't work for a long time, and especially during the court case, which court cases can go on for ages, like years, and every time there's another court hearing coming up, you're trying to work on these court documents, but it's triggering all these massive limbic responses. So you're going into fear, confusion, shutdown, and hyperarousal, and for a long time it sort of, the whole conflict kind of occupies your waking thoughts day and night, so it's really difficult to hold down a job. and because you can't think rationally or logically, you begin to make really poor quality decisions. So I, for example, I guess one of maybe the unwise things that I did was I decided to rent a house around the corner from where my second child was now living, which was a long way away from where I live, 5 hours drive. I mean, financially it was very expensive, but also kind of in terms of my self-care, it wasn't a great idea, because I was now spending time in a place where I didn't have any support network, and I was also spending days there without even being able to see my child. So it was almost hard. It was like torture, and I put myself in that situation because I guess I was hoping that somehow things would just soften and work out, but they didn't, and I can accept that now. What else did I do? Yeah, like I mentioned before, I just did a lot of travelling, and wasn't that aware of the impact, the kind of cumulative impact of all these stresses on me. So, okay, so that's polyvagal. Another thing I do with my clients is something called affect labeling. So it's a way of bringing the neocortex functions sort of back online when we're in the limbic survival state, and it's really simple. It's an amazingly simple idea, but it works. So it's about labeling your emotions and your sensations, and this is very much about the body. It's very biological. So if we can get better at naming the sensations that we're feeling, and it's very interesting hearing from my clients like the sort of manifestations of all this stress and fear and toxicity in their bodies. They often have very similar, they'll describe like really tight feelings around their chests, and a lot of them have described like a weight on their shoulders, and that's something I really identified with as well, like just a physical weight. Really, you can feel it. So the more fluent we get at doing that, the more we can kind of down regulate the limbic responses, because we're bringing online the language centers and especially in the group work, the empathy centers, and we're kind of pulling ourselves back into the green zone or the amber zone, but a less extreme version of the amber zone. So we're kind of moving into green, and also an important piece of this work is inner child work, which is really, it's about coming back into connection with yourself, and we can't be in connection with anyone else unless we're in connection with ourselves, and we want to be in connection with others because we need to somehow start thinking about how do we come out of this conflict. How do we get out of the survival mode? And if our ex can't get out of survival mode for now, then how do we get out of it? So how do we connect with ourselves? And the inner child work is really about that. So this could be anything around going back in time and reflecting on who were the important mentors in our early life, and what did we take from them, the positive and the negatives. How did they model how to be in relationship, and what was our relationship like with our father, and our mother or our carers, and those sorts of insights can open up a lot of more understanding around this trauma response that we're going through as separated fathers. Okay, so yeah, there's another piece about polyvagal theory that's really fascinating, which is, and there's more and more kind of research happening into this, which is how our nervous systems actually communicate with each other. So if you're working as a therapist, like, I mean, non-verbally, so if you're working as a therapist, you know, it would be my job to get my nervous system into a state in the green zone, so I can serve as the anchor for my client. And I'm really interested in supporting separated fathers learn to do that for their broken families, even if they're not speaking to their ex or their child. It does actually have an effect if you can start to change your state, and you know what follows is a change in how you feel, and spiritually, psychologically, but maybe spiritually as well, and that can actually change the dynamic. And that kind of takes me on to looking at your family as an organism. So this is about systemic thinking around the whole, instead of separating everything out like we tend to do in our culture and our kind of approach to understanding things, you know, we try and go really granular. So we, in a conflict over child access, it'll end up in court often, and then it becomes very adversarial and who's wrong and who's right, and sort of this picking apart all the time. But actually, in my experience, doing the opposite can be really supportive of a healing, de-escalating outcome. So, okay, the family has broken up, but the family is still an organism. Just as, you know, you can think of a community of human beings as an organism, and a family as an organism. And there's a really simple insight from this, which is that if the father can change how he is, if he can change how he feels and how he behaves, then that has to change the other pieces, the other parts of the family. And that's a kind of a paradoxical thing, because you can't change someone else until you change. You can't change the behaviour of your ex. And that's the confusion that a lot of these guys get into, including myself, which is when you're stuck in the survival mode, you want to do something. You don't want to let your child down. You want to do the right thing. You want to be a good father. So you end up going through the court process, and maybe you do okay, but there's all sorts of costs associated with that which don't serve the child in the long term, which I'll get into a bit later. And looking at this whole situation in a systemic way, I feel is way more hopeful and way more productive, because there's a level of acceptance there that, you know, at some point everything's going to calm down, and systemic theory is all about how organisms go back to some kind of homeostasis. They always do. That's just what nature does. And you know, you're going to have a relationship with your child. You know, it's going to happen. It's just not clear how or when. And if you can start to accept that you can't change what your ex-partner is doing, you can only change what you're doing and how you're feeling, then it starts to open up quite a hopeful path to changing the dynamic. And part of that, I guess, is starting to, just check the time, okay, is starting to explore the dynamic with your ex. So empathically, but obviously to do that you can't be in survival mode, because you need to be able to actually empathize. So, you know, asking questions like, what was the dynamic when we were together, and what's the dynamic about now? Like, no one is going to stop their own child seeing its other parent lightly, so there's got to be a reason why that's happening. And you may feel that it's unfair, but that's not really it's difficult to swallow at first, but that's not really relevant whether it's fair or not. What's really important is trying to understand what's driving that behaviour. Is it from fear? Is it from not wanting you to move on with your life, so trying to get your undivided attention by, using the child as a proxy? Or is it that revenge, which is coming from pain and grief ultimately? There's all sorts of things that could be happening. I'm just saying it can be really, when the client is ready, it can be really a valuable process to actually explore with empathy and understanding without any more blame and judgment. And I know that's not easy to do, but I got to a point where I actually felt a visceral shift. I was able to just let go, and I went from thinking about all this stuff every day and night to just letting go and accepting, and I felt a weight literally come off my shoulders. It was just such a relief. I could breathe again, and that didn't happen overnight. I had to do a lot of work. I did a lot of things like meditation, breath work, body work, like somatic work, therapy, journaling, all sorts of different healing activities. And the good thing is that a lot of those things are free, and also being in community, being in connection. So being in connection with good friends and with nature, and then like meditating and breath work I found really helpful. So it's everyone's different, it's whatever really works, but I offer those sorts of things to my clients, and grounding practices, coming back into the body, feeling your feet on the ground, noticing your body sensations, just to bring yourself back into connection with your body. So that all goes together in my experience, and it can lead you to this point where you're able to actually accept and let go and step away from the survival response, the limbic response. So I've got 10 minutes left. So the court is it's a very toxic experience in my experience and many people I know, and I would just say that for many dads, they're already in the machine, so they kind of have to carry on. But I would always counsel people who are I was also strongly advised not to go to court, and I waited for a while before I did. But it's just that once you're in that machine, it's almost like you're locking yourself into the survival limbic state in a way, because every time another hearing comes up, you have to go back into reading all the old emails and getting your case and then responding to allegations, and all of this stuff is very counter to the healing process in my experience, and it has implications that you might not realise. Like with war, civil wars are the worst. They're the most hateful often, and the kind, like the English Civil War and the American Civil War. Quite apart from being extremely brutal and bloody, both of them were really confusing for participants. Like in the English Civil War, people often didn't really know why they were fighting, and they would swap sides, and there would be kind of interfamilial fractures because people would end up on different sides, like in the American Civil War, and these fractures have lasted. In the case of the English Civil War, they were coming back up again recently with Brexit, and now in America they're coming up again with the election. So they don't go away. So that's my concern about court, really, is that there's all these unseen costs at the time that you'll only realise later. So that interfamilial break where there could have been a support network for the child, and that might be permanently gone now or poisoned. And it's really difficult to heal that stuff because it's such a polarizing process, and that's not serving the child. And it's not that anyone's wrong. It's like it's a normal, natural thing for your friends and loved ones to support you and then corroborate your story around what's happening. But the longer that goes on for, the less chance there is of having a kind of unified story where people can you end up with two realities. Like that's what happens in polarized discourse, like we're seeing a lot in the world at the moment. So yeah, the thing about court is that things can always get worse. So even if you've got a really good reason for going to court and you do okay, my experience was that the judiciary was pretty reasonable, and I felt heard, and I got pretty good outcomes. But that doesn't mean it was necessarily the best way of solving the problem, because it's not solved. You'll only ever get, in English court, family court system at least, you'll only ever get, a court order that will last you another couple of years. So you're going to have to learn to co-parent anyway, unless you want to keep going back to court. And you're just creating more and more toxicity each time. It's a great quote about war here from John Steinbeck. All war is a symptom of man's failure as a thinking animal. So that's really speaking to, I'll just say that again. All war is a symptom of man's failure as a thinking animal. And I feel that really speaks to the model of the brain of, losing the capacity for empathy and reason and going limbic into fight, flight and freeze. Because, this happens on an individual and a collective level all the time. But I think our work is, rather than blaming and sort of demonizing the enemy, is trying to come back to a more compassionate, holistic, loving place where we can, on an individual level, if we can see that our ex-partner isn't ready to come out of survival, to be able to accept that and to be able to hold that and hold the whole situation in a kind of compassionate way, and just trust that if I can do that, then I'm serving my child in the best way I possibly can, and I can feel genuine compassion for my ex, and I'm not angry anymore. And that was one thing I experienced when I finally felt the sensation of just letting go, is that there was no more anger, and that was such a gorgeous feeling. It was just like, because that's poison. It's just to hold on to anger actually is so damaging, and it's not just damaging for you as the individual and your body and your soul, but it seeps out and it affects everyone around you, and it affects the relationships, and it affects the people you work with. It's really poisonous. Okay. I've just got a few more minutes. I'm wary I don't want to go over. So yeah, the next point is about healing, and I guess I've already touched on this, but it's about taking radical responsibility for yourself and being clear on what you need as a father to look after yourself. Because if you can look after yourself, then that's the first step to being the best father you can be. So that's about putting in boundaries, like for me that was about deciding not to spend, God, I don't know how many hours I used to spend driving. It was a 6 or 7 hour drive one way, so, and I was doing that, you know, every couple of weeks. So, you know, I don't want to do that anymore, and I put my boundaries in. But I had to get over this sort of feeling of shame around failure as a father to do that. So there was work there around also, you know, the shame around why have I produced these two broken families. So healing work there is about trying to bring some compassion and understanding and acceptance to yourself. Yeah, and I guess part of my work is framing that process in terms of masculine archetypes. Like, if you want to serve your child and be the best father you can be, then we need to look at you need to look after yourself. And how do you look after yourself? Well, you start to forgive yourself and be compassionate, and that can be quite hard. You know, we become very hard, and it can be quite difficult to break that down at first. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to finish on the thing around attachment, which is, you know, there's loads of evidence now that children really do need their fathers in their lives for loads of different reasons, and it's come up in a big body of research called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and you know, if there's a cost, you know, I want to find ways of helping the family court system understand that, okay, while it's good to protect children from possible harm from dangerous parents, it's also harmful to separate them from parents, and so there has to be a balance. And there's a lot of research now that would support a more balanced way of looking at that. And again, I think it would be really healthy and helpful to differentiate between types of domestic abuse and domestic violence, because, you know, the base rate of domestic violence is actually very low. It's 3 or 4% in various studies. So I think the thresholds need to be looked at. There's a sort of distortion happening where children are losing contact with their fathers who shouldn't be, and it's not very. These are really kind of uncontroversial concepts, like attachment. To disturb a child's attachment with its father is a massive thing, a damaging thing, and there's loads of evidence there now. I mean, ACEs show that, you know, the long-term health and mental health effects of having 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, and this could just one is moving house. One could be your parents separating. One could be having a parent who has depression. One could be conflict. Your parent is involved in conflict. You know, so I think it's fair to say that having 2 parents who are involved in a court battle for 6 years is probably going to qualify as an ACE. Having a father who's not allowed to see you is probably going to qualify as an ACE. That's after your parents have separated, and one or both of your parents are going to probably be really anxious and depressed if they're in a court fight for years. So I just wanted to end on that. You know, let's keep it child-centric, and thank you for watching. And I'll leave some of my details on the screen now, and I'd welcome conversations with anyone who's interested in helping me get this stuff to the people who need it, like the judiciary and maybe CAFCAS. Maybe I'm being a bit naive, I don't know. But yeah, thank you so much. I'm really honoured to be invited to ICMI 2020. Thank you.